your butts.
So how did education work in the ancient world for people who are writing things like this? Because we know, like, the Jesus' disciples were fishermen, tax collectors, alleged physicians of some kind or another, none of which are probably able to write on this level. So how did authors like this become educated? Because you didn't, I don't know, was it the Shepherd of Hermes says he was a slave, but he offered to copy. So you didn't have to like be of royalty, like some people seem to think. You could be a slave and somehow have the education to do this. There's several accounts of that. So
no, that's
how did this
very
happen?
important point. Yep. So one thing that I try to be careful about in the book is to say, and I think I say it like in the introduction, and I kind of pepper it throughout. When I talk about elite cultural producers or literate cultural producers, the second I use the word elite, and because we know literature is relatively rarefied, being able to produce and read literature is rarefied, people automatically think rich people. But that's not the case in the ancient world.
Right.
It's definitely the case that you can be highly educated because you're enslaved. I mentioned Epictetus, who is a former slave and becomes a famous philosopher in the book, but I didn't really get into that aspect. So before I even go on, I want to recommend the work of Canada Moss, who has a book forthcoming called God's Ghostwriters, which talks about enslaved persons who are also highly educated. I know this book is just going to blow everything up. It's amazing.
Oh, man.
And so I think her work is an important correction or addition to what I'm about to say, because I don't get into that idea of enslavement as much as I probably should have in the book. But you have a couple of things going on with the gospel authors. So number one, when I say elite cultural producer, literate cultural producer, what I mean is somebody who's part of, like, let's say 4 5%. Some people will say it's closer to like 10-20% of the ancient world, but usually that incorporates people who can like sign their name or write a receipt, which is not the same thing as reading and writing literature. So I tend to date it a little, or put the number a little bit, under 10% of people can do this in antiquity, and their social context has a lot to do with how good they are at it, but also how advanced are they in ancient schooling, which is called paideia. And what you have with the gospel writers is somebody who is not at the pinnacle of paideia, meaning for whatever reason, they have not gone to school long enough so that they're absolute masters of the language. But there are a few people who were, even fewer people who were at that level. Thinking here about someone like a Virgil. I know we're talking Latin, but somebody who is at that very high level. You also have relatively few, comparatively extant authors writing in Koine Greek, which is what the gospel authors are writing in, which is more of a sort of common Greek that
it's like street Greek kind
of, well, what happens is Alexander the Great, after he unifies everybody, there are all these different dialects. And so Koine Greek kind of becomes like the one Greek everybody can sort of figure out, like everybody can more or less communicate in that style of Greek. But yeah, it is a little bit, it's not that high, like formal Greek of some of the, great canons of Greek literature. And so then you're left with questions like, okay, what was going on with Mark? Because if you read his Greek, he's very repetitive. The sentence structure is very simple. It kind of looks like another kind of text that circulated in the ancient world that was called paradoxography, which tended to be sort of these short, almost pithy might be the wrong word, but like these little vignettes on talking about miracle stories from the ancient world. And that really kind of fits the bill in some ways for what you're finding in the Gospels. But he also does a lot of weird things in the Greek, like a little bit of strange sentence structure. And also he sometimes has certain Latin words that he kind of Greekifies certain Latin words. And you're like, why is he doing that? So like, it may be that this guy's, his first language is not Greek. Yeah, but who knows, right? Like I hate those kind of speculative ideas, but something's going on there where like something with his education, like there's not a great facility here. And even though like we're dealing with like copies of copies, to the extent that's been preserved, there's still coherence to the text and his voice as an author, but it's a little disjointed. So these gospel authors, Luke is very, very good. all, he's kind of at the level of a Greek novel, but he's still not writing an epic, in the way, he's kind of striving to do that. It's not super, super polished. But each one of these guys, they're kind of doing their best work. And I think anybody who's able to write anything along these lines is part of that tier. So ancient education, I would say the things to keep in mind that are important for us are you had to have a certain amount of leisure time and to learn, to go to school, to practice, to master, quote unquote, the language. And whether, I don't mean to say leisure time in the sense of just like, kicking back and enjoying yourself. Somebody might have been forced to do this, per our conversation about enslavement.
Time where you're not making bricks, time in between brick making.
To stay alive, right? Yeah, you're not a subsistence farmer. You, for whatever reason within your social context, are able to spend the time to learn the language and learn how to write, because otherwise you're in the fields. Otherwise you're fishing for your life, like you're trying
from literally from dusk till dawn. Like you're working nonstop. That's your whole life.
Or you're running a shop, or you're a baker, or, you're in the artisan class. You're not able to just kind of kick back. And so that's who we're talking about, is somebody. And so now the question becomes, okay, what is the specific social context? That's something that, I am playing with in the next book, but I stayed away from in this one because I don't like the speculation, because it very quickly becomes like the slippery slope of starting to make claims about who these guys were. And I'm not sure we will ever be able to reconstruct that fully. And so I try to stay away from any of those arguments that say like, and so clearly they were, that kind of mirror reading of like, now we know that they were like part of the synagogue, back to that Matthean argument, right? I tried to stay away from any of that because I just don't know, and I don't think we'll ever know. But I tried to keep it to what do I know about ancient education, what it takes to write and publish a piece, and what I see evident in these texts for that literate community that they're a part of.
Yeah. And even still, like, even if you did like reach a higher level of education, and as far as like literacy or high level literacy words, that's still very different from being a scribe. Like being a scribe was like a league of its own. It was its own trade. You got to be trained to be a professional scribe. If you were just literate, you could write down and copy things, but you weren't like trained on the level of a professional scribe. So you'd make a lot of mistakes. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting research about scribes, and somebody who's worked on this, Sarah Rollins, Bill Arnall. There's a moment for a few years there where there's a fair amount of scholarship being like, well, we don't want to say they're elites. We don't want to say they're like rich guys, but we know they had to have a fair amount of education. So maybe they were scribes. And I felt like it was kind of an attempt to keep them like, like scribes are kind of a little bit, or like at least keep them at a tier. I think there's a tendency to like assume, well, the early Christian follower had to be kind of in a lower tier of society. Because we imagine that from the Gospels, Jesus's followers were, peasant class. Even though we know that's not necessarily the case from Paul's letters, but it's another one of those like romantic fantasies about early Christianity that I think persist. And so the scribe was kind of a sweet spot where you didn't have to admit that they were like super educated, but they were like, like still kind of working class. And I have to think more about the scribe issue because I did research it for the book. And I couldn't get myself away from the idea that like people are trying too hard to make the scribe fit. But I could be maybe convinced otherwise. But scribes tended to, again, very sort of specialized knowledge or precise knowledge in their training, depending on what they're there for. So if a scribe is there to kind of, copy a text, for example, they didn't necessarily have to know what they were looking at to copy it. You just had to be a good copyist. You didn't have to actually read it. So that kind of thing becomes a little more complicated when it comes to scribes.
Yeah, again, in the Shepherd of Hermes, what didn't he say? I have to. He said he's copying a book, a religious text, trying to remember, he got from an old woman, and he said he had to copy like one syllable at a time because he couldn't distinguish the difference, he couldn't distinguish the syllables because he was at the time they're writing in what's called Scriptura Continuum.
Scriptio Continua.
Right?
Yeah. Continua.
Yeah.
Scriptio Continua. Yeah.
Scriptio Continuum. Yeah. It sounds like a Harry Potter spell, but it's not.
It does.
Yeah, this was a method of writing where there's Scriptio Continuum and all the letters just squished together. This was a method of writing where you didn't have spaces in between your letters. You didn't have margins. You literally filled up the paper. And one of the reasons this was done, for everyone watching, is papyrus was expensive. It wasn't like paper today. If you wanted to write something down, you had to fork over some coin in order to get papyrus. So you wanted to get as much as you could out of that piece of papyrus. So they would just fill every single corner and get rid of every single gap that they possibly could, and write as small as they could to get as much as they could out of that piece of papyrus. So that caused a lot of problems with early scribes, copyists.
Well, yeah, I mean, we even have some examples where like they clearly like lost their line of sight and repeated a line, like in Luke, like they there's like something missing because some scribe somewhere like fell asleep or something. I don't know, just kind of like lost their.
Well, they would skip like an entire line or.
Yeah, definitely.
Hold on to your butts.